The book The Things They Carried has many examples of dissent against the war in Vietnam. The first example that I found was on page 38. It says, "I was drafted to fight a war I hated." This especially is shown in that the young people of that era typically had no idea what the war was actually about, and they just didn't want to go to war. They didn't want to leave their families, they didn't want to leave the school, they didn't want to leave everything that they had known their whole life. So they were just against the war for that reason. The second example that I found about Tim O'Brien's personal experience was on page 39. "A million things all at once. I was too good for this war." This especially shows the ignorance of the young people of the time and how they thought that they were better than the war, and they thought that they didn't need to participate in it just because they were smart or they had everything figured out and they were going to go on to good things, but they didn't realize that the war in Vietnam was something that they needed to participate in, and they needed to support their country in that, whether or not they agreed with the reasons behind it. While we first read about avoiding the war in Vietnam and the things they carried, we also see it in many images from that era. There were many strategies for avoiding the war. One of them was straight out protest and neglect of orders. Many people, when they received a draft notice, would simply burn it, even though it was illegal. That is what the image shows, is a group of young men burning their draft cards. This next image shows a newspaper article from the Alligator, an anti-war newsletter that was released in the Northwest. It shows images of people saying, "We won't go," and protesting against the war in general. Many of these people weren't even protesting the war itself, but they were protesting the draft. The draft was based on many things, including economic, class, and education level, and careers. This was especially racist against black people who had just been out of slavery for a while and were still feeling the effects of that. They obviously were earning less money, and they didn't have as prestigious of jobs and had less education levels. So a much higher percentage of the black population was sent on to the war versus the Caucasian/Asian American members of society. I did my interview with my grandpa, Glenn Verbrugge, who was a medical doctor in Korea during the Vietnam War. He avoided Vietnam itself by becoming a specialist, and he talked about how, and I quote, "The Berry plan would defer you for up to 4 years, but then you would definitely feel your commitment to the war." My grandpa ended up being able to go to Korea instead of Vietnam because he chose to be a specialist and signed up for the reserves while he was still in school becoming that specialist. He avoided going to Vietnam because he chose to move on further with his career and specify in one specific thing instead of just being a general doctor, which then he would have been immediately sent off to Vietnam after being drafted. Many doctors did this. That was one of their ways of avoiding the Vietnam War, or they would just stay in school for as long as possible, hoping that the war would end.
War is no trivial matter. What people consider necessities become luxuries. Families are broken and cities fall. But time has changed our conception of war. With the modern influence of video games and Hollywood movies, war now seems like a thing of the past, a surreal vision unlikely to ever cast a shadow over our lives. Yet just over 50 years ago, the subject of war pervaded society and threatened the livelihoods of millions around the world. The United States has often resorted to conscripting soldiers in times of war. Also known as the draft, conscription by the United States during the Vietnam War was met with heavy opposition. As such, some protested the war by refusing to respond to the call of duty. These people escaped to many different countries such as Canada, and many never returned again despite being granted amnesty. Large groups of draft dodgers settled down in areas including Montreal, Toronto, and BC, particularly in the Slocan Valley. Our question is, what social class did most of these draft dodgers come from, and why. So how did the draft actually work? Basically, when a man was 18, he would be signed up for the draft and have a chance of getting picked for active duty when the country needed more soldiers. The draft process was supposed to be made fairer by randomization, but in reality, it discriminated against lower-class African Americans. The selective service system grouped civilians into classes. Say, for example, if you had a job or were pursuing a college degree, you were more likely to be placed in a category to be deferred. While about 3.4% of Caucasian Americans were unemployed at the time, nearly double that amount of African Americans faced unemployment, and they were thus statistically more likely to be drafted for military service. Another important statistic is that blacks only made about 60% of the income that whites did on average during the 1960s, and in terms of education, far fewer blacks graduated from college relative to population. Though many draftees did not want to involve themselves in the war, they were legally obligated to do so. Those who were willing to give up everything they had in the United States, however, had to have the financial and educational resources to do so. It is no surprise, then, that most draft dodgers were middle-class Caucasian Americans who had those resources. A Caucasian with a college degree, for example, could at least find a job and survive outside of his country. Without a solid background and enough money, it would have been extremely difficult to start a new life in another country. Therefore, although many blacks did not believe in the war, they had no other alternative but to fight.
Studying this topic of draft dodging and general dissent against the Vietnam War has led me to see one major theme. Ignorance can lead people to make many poor decisions. This is shown especially by the draft dodgers in that they ran away from a war where they were needed badly to help to protect the ideals of their country.